Welcome to another episode of Insight. On today's show, we have with us in the studio Rizwan Safir, a senior research consultant specializing in archaeology and museums. Rizwan has over 10 years' experience working in the Middle East. He has worked for the British Museum, Humboldt University in Berlin, and the Copenhagen University. Rizwan has also worked at various institutions on excavation and heritage conservation projects in the Middle East, including in Egypt, Palestine, and Saudi Arabia. We'll be speaking with Rizwan shortly on the development of new museums and exhibitions in the Gulf region. But before we do all that, let's take a short look at a day in the life of the archaeologist, Rizwan Safir.
Hi there, welcome. We're now at the University of Reading campus. My name is Rizwan Safir and we'll be going into the archaeology building to look at what happens after an excavation and some of the material related to archaeology. So we're now here at the University of Reading, and the Reading University Department has a specific facility for the study of archaeology. So students as well as researchers come together here to look at finds from archaeological research, and that's what we'll be doing as we go inside. So we're now inside the University of Reading's Archaeology Department. So in here there's a number of areas which are specialised in, that the Archaeology Department here focuses on. Things such as environmental archaeology, things such as specific finds, the things that you find from excavations. Also zooarchaeology, which is about animal bones, osteology, which is about human remains, but also things such as museum studies, the relationship between archaeological research and how that then translates into the field of museums. So we'll now take a look around the building. So we're now here inside the Environmental Sciences Department of the Archaeology facility here at Reading, and we'll be going into this room, which is looking at things such as flotation, and I'll explain to you exactly what happens in this room. So this is the room where the flotation work happens, and we're going to find out a little bit more about what flotation is. And I have here actually a good old friend of mine, Rory. We studied together, and Rory is now a technician at Reading University. So we'll find out more about how this process works. So Rory, tell me about what flotation is and how this process works.
So the process of flotation is when you're in a field excavating away, you may come across a pit or a post hole or a well, for example. What we then look for is organic remains so that we can reconstruct the vegetation, what was around at the time, and maybe what they were eating.
So it's basically a way to separate the soil from the organic remains and the finds which are left behind. Yes. So it becomes easier to start to look at the soil in a bit more detail. Right, thank you, Rory. One other thing I just wanted to show you in terms of what takes place here. You can see these weird looking, elongated, very heavy metal tubes. What these are for environmental core samples. So what happens in the field is if you go to a particular area where there's been a lot of rain deposit or build-up of deposits over time. So things such as at the bottom of a mountain or a bottom of a valley. And what you can do is you can pull together a large number of these together, these core samples, put them into the ground, and you extract the sample, and you can start to date those samples. And what you get is a picture of what the environment and how it's changed over time. And I think, Rory, there are some samples that we can maybe see here behind you that maybe you can show us very quickly.
What we have over here is where we store all of these samples when they come back, ready to be looked at in this freezer.
So these are a number of samples that have been taken, and then these can then be analysed in a microscope and then also be dated through radiocarbon dating to start to get a picture over time of how the environment has changed. So we're now moving from the flotation room into the bone lab. So this is where we can look at some human remains. So we're now here in the lab or the room, which is focusing on osteoarchaeology. Osteoarchaeology essentially looks at human remains, but also you can see behind me, or not only human remains, but also zooarchaeology. So zooarchaeology deals with animal remains. So what can we find out from human remains? We have a few examples here which goes exactly into that. And there's a lot of science that you can start to see from specific human remains in terms of how people lived things such as diseases that they had, some traumatic events, whether it's a break in their bone, but also stresses, so whether laborers and the effects that it's had on their bones over time, also things such as tattoos. So let's start to look at some of the examples we have here. So as you can see here, we have an example of a young male. These are bones that survived from almost 1,000 years ago in a site called St. Oswald's Priory. And what we do, or researchers do, when they're looking at human remains, is to look for signs for different forms of diseases. Here, examples that you can see in terms of the way that the bones have worn away show that this male most likely had disease such as leprosy. So if you continue with me, we'll here now look at some more examples of the human remains that have been laid out on display. These are again all from St. Oswald's Priory, and here you have examples of the different parts of the spine. And from here it is able to determine, or archaeologists and researchers are able to determine, evidence of diseases such as tuberculosis. And I think one of the more interesting ones laid out here is almost a complete example of a child's remains. So you can see just the sheer size, but you can also see the effects of the disease on the bones. They've been worn away quite significantly. A lot of that will be to do with preservation over time, lying in the soil and erosion taking place and degradation of the bones. But also there's evidence here of from the pelvis and different parts of the body that this child suffered tuberculosis, which was quite common in medieval England. You can also see here the examples of the teeth which have survived from the child. Teeth are a very important aspect of research in terms of finding out how people used to live. The level of teeth that have been worn away is an indication of the type of diet that children had or populations had at the time. And also generally you can start to determine things such as age and sex also from the teeth remains. And again here you've got the actual skull of the child remains here. So these are examples of some of the human remains that students and researchers here at the University of Reading examine for understanding more about human remains from the past. So this was an introduction to osteology and the human remains and how they're studied. We'll now be going to the finds lab to look at some of the other aspects that come out from excavations. So we're here now in the Allen Lab at the University of Reading. This is the teaching collection where students and researchers can start to interrogate some of the finds which come out from excavations. And what do we mean by finds? We mean everyday material and tools that were used by human populations. So we have here an example of a flint cleaver. There's also examples here of hand axes, and you can start to see examples of how this was made. So this would have been a large core, something similar to this, a large block of flint, and what human populations or prehistoric humans would have been doing is napping away at this from various angles to then cut it and refine it to make the intended axe or hand axe or knife or whatever it may be that they're trying to produce. And these you can start to see the examples of from the flint block here. So these were examples of some of the stone tools from what's known as the Upper Paleolithic or the Middle Paleolithic, essentially the early and Middle Stone Age. And when you start to get to the Neolithic, which was the New Stone Age, as it translates as the New Stone Age, it's this period just before humans start to adopt farming. And so at this point, the humans are experts at crafting stone tools. And you can see examples of some of the polished Neolithic stone tools here, also this polished stone axe head, and you can see how incredibly smooth it was. So there's a bit of an aesthetic quality to it also. It's not only for use, but humans now are so good at crafting these stone tools that you start to have polished examples which probably weren't even used, more ceremonial use. And then from the Stone Age or from the Neolithic, you start to have metal, the introduction of metal, and you can see some early examples of how metal tools were crafted. You start to have axes from here, so these would have been hafted with a point and there, and then this you've got the axe head, and then you also have really ornate and really incredible smaller examples of axe heads or chisels or scrapers, and of course you start to have the use of metal for more jewelry and adornment. You can see here for an early Iron Age ring, similar example of a ring here, and this is a miniature socketed axe, so this wouldn't have been used, but you can start to see the precision with which populations were now crafting metal for ceremonial use. And another example here of a weight, so this would have been a weight, and you've got a face there also of an individual. So we looked at some examples of different stone tools from earlier periods such as the Neolithic, Paleolithic and early Bronze Age. And now we're looking at just a couple of examples of finds from the Roman Empire. So here you have an example of Samian ware. Samian ware was known as some of the more fine quality pottery. So when you find this, you know that this is a bit more wouldn't be used on an everyday basis. It'd be used perhaps for ceremonies or on special occasions. These were produced actually in the north of France in the Empire of Gaul, which was part of the Roman Empire, but they were shipped across the Roman Empire. So there was a huge industry for pottery such as this. And then you also have other finds such as glazed ware, which would have been used something like this for a candlestick, so to house a candlestick. So this is just some of the examples of the various finds that researchers and students have access to here in the Allen Lab. So that was a brief introduction about the archaeology department here at Reading University and a day in the life of an archaeologist here at the department.
Viewers, as you have seen there, a brief glimpse into a day in the life of Mr. Rizwan Safir. So without further ado, let's speak to the man himself and understand a bit more about his career decisions and how he got to where he is today. So Rizwan, first of all, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure. So first of all, let's start with the basics of archaeology. What is it and how does it impact the average person on the street?
So the word archaeology actually comes from Greek, and it comes from the words archaic and logos, meaning ancient history, essentially the study of ancient history. And what it entails is the physical search for human history, where we leave a trace behind in our ancient past. Archaeologists come and look for those traces of our human remains and try to piece together the evidence, to try to understand what was taking place. So in terms of your question about why it relates to everyday people, I think it has a very deep connection with our human past. We always have this trying to understand more about where we came from. And so through being able to understand where we came from, it would help us chart the path in terms of how we progress forward. We look at examples of civilizations in the past to be able to understand that. And that's where the archaeologist comes in to look for the physical remains of those civilizations.
Okay. And so in terms of a young budding archaeologist, what would one have to do to get into the field of archaeology? What sort of subjects would one take and what kind of grades would they need as well?
So it is quite varied in the sense of the subjects that you're able to take. The ones that I would say are preferred are definitely subjects such as geography, history, of course, preferably ancient history. I think there used to be an archaeology GCSE and A-level. I don't think that exists anymore, but it's not an issue as such because subjects such as history and geography are definitely favored. But at the same time, scientific subjects are definitely favored also. So biology and chemistry, and to some extent physics, because a lot of scientific investigation sits behind archaeological analysis. And so having that background and that foundation will allow you to succeed in careers in archaeology.
You know, often we see solutions are needed for future issues and problems, and often we see research addresses those issues. Does your research address any types of issues that are currently existing or future?
I think archaeology definitely has a place to play, and I can give you a couple of examples that I think are very pertinent to our current day situation. One is, for example, environmental focus. There's a huge environmental focus today about how to live sustainably. And one of the things that archaeology does is shows us how civilizations have lived in the past. There's a big revolution which took place, for example, known as the Neolithic. And the Neolithic was this transition from when humans lived as hunter-gatherers to then moving into becoming farming societies. And initially, there was a lot of problems with that because humans weren't used to this relationship of how we were meant to live. So, for example, where you used to have issues with perhaps sanitation, even social issues with neighbors, where we were hunter-gatherers, you simply move on. When you start to live together in settled communities, there started to be more difficulties in terms of how people were living with one another. They started to have diseases prevalent because as you stay in one place, the spread of pandemics starts to happen. So actually, things such as the spread of pandemics, things such as environmental history and how we can learn from our relationship with the environment, a lot of that comes from archaeology. And unless we're able to understand those lessons from the past, it's very hard to understand how best to move forward.
So it helps in terms of future modelling as well?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, future modelling is a big
And
aspect.
let's talk about yourself and your colleagues in your research. Have you experienced any sort of scientific breakthroughs in your research?
I think one example comes to mind. We were involved with, this was with the British Museum. We were involved in an excavation in 2013, I believe it was. It was a site named Amara West. This was in the north of Sudan, near the border with Egypt. And we were working on this site. It was an Egyptian settlement, so it dates to about 1000 BC from what's called the New Kingdom of Egypt, so about 4,000 years ago. And aside from the settlement itself, we were trying to find out about how people lived every day. There was, of course, burials being a big aspect of understanding how people used to live in society. And one of the burials that we came across was a mummified body and the remains. Now, at the time, it seemed like any other body that we were excavating. It didn't seem to be particularly relevant. But post-analysis of the excavation found that this was the earliest example of a human body which they had studied for metastatic cancer as a form of cancer. Now, why is that important? When biologists and medics in particular are undertaking research, they also have to look at how pathogens and different diseases behave over time and how they evolve. And so by finding this discovery, it was able to start to look back in time and see the evolution of cancer, for example, and different types of cancer in helping medical research today. So I think that's one example that comes to mind of perhaps a breakthrough, you can call it, in research.
Amazing, fascinating. And so in terms of the average person on the street, the research that you do and that your team does, how could that have an impact or a positive impact on the average person in the street? How does it have any relevance to you or I or somebody else outside?
I think one thing which is really important about archaeology is providing first-hand evidence. And what I mean about this is, we're in this world today of social media, and there's a lot of talk about fake news and news coming in second-hand. And history is often, and we know this famous example about history being written by the victors, people who are victorious. What archaeology does is it cuts through a lot of that and goes to the primary evidence. And I think in the context of something such as, obviously this is a program by MTA Africa, and I'll talk about this a bit further in detail. African civilizations are underrepresented. And why is that? It's because European civilizations who came, particularly in the 18th, 19th century, colonized Africa. History was written from their perspective. What archaeology does is we strip back that layer of bias in a way, and we look at the evidence for civilizations of the past. And for example, in Africa, there are so many civilizations that people have never heard of. And if you're able to then provide evidence of writing, of intellectual endeavors in terms of flourishing of trade on the African continent, well before any European colonization took place, it allows you to cut through in terms of that historical narrative of Europe basically colonizing Africa, and there being no sense of history before this point. So I think that's one example of how it can relate to everyday life. It provides a sense of pride from where you've come from, but also it provides you a sense of understanding of what used to take place in the past and how people used to live, and how we can use that to influence our life decisions in the current day.
So it sort of depoliticizes the whole history.
Absolutely.
And leaves the core facts. And
absolutely. I think
excellent.
So, yeah.
Fascinating. Rizwan, thank you for sharing your insight with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. And now we will move on to the next part of the program where Rizwan will walk us through his research in more detail. So over to you, Rizwan.
So in the previous segment where we were on site at the university, we were almost looking at it backwards. We were looking at what happens after an excavation. What I thought would be useful today is to talk a little bit about what happens during the excavation. How archaeologists, one, find the site. Second, what happens at the actual excavation and how that process works. And third, with that information, what are we able to find out about societies of the past? So essentially what archaeology is doing is revealing the unseen, revealing clues and evidence about past civilizations through physical remains. And when searching for our past, what researchers and archaeologists do is they use a number of different tools. The first aspect, what we have to find out and determine, is where the sites are. And this varies around the world. And traditionally what would happen for an archaeological site would be the physical requirement to travel on and survey a piece of land or an area of land and then find an archaeological site. Now, of course, that's very difficult, particularly when trying to reach areas which are very remote, or perhaps even various landscapes which are difficult to reach. And what's happened in recent years, and particularly over the last decade or so, is a reliance on more forms of technology to utilize this for archaeological research. And I thought this would be useful to talk about today. So one aspect which has really revolutionized and pioneered archaeological research has been survey from space, essentially the use of satellite technology to identify archaeological sites from around the world. Google Maps being a good example, you being able to survey an entire landscape and see clues and evidence for perhaps structures, for anomalies that can be seen in the landscape, whether there's big features or sites that look a little bit different. And utilizing this material, or utilizing content and data from satellite surveys, archaeologists can then start to look at potential sites to excavate. Here are some examples from satellite imagery of archaeological sites that have been identified. On the left-hand side, you can see this fortress that was found in the Sahara. This is a site in Libya. This was otherwise a barren stretch of land in the sense that it was in the depths of the Sahara Desert. And to actually survey these sites would be incredibly difficult, let alone potentially being a futile exercise. You can imagine setting off on a Jeep or a 4x4 to go into the desert. Most of the time, you're not going to be able to find something. And through satellite imagery, it cuts out a lot of that time to be able to focus on where these sites are found. And this image on the left is a perfect representation of that. So with that in mind, there's a number of techniques once you've identified where the potential site may be. And this is known as remote sensing or geophysics. Now, there's three popular strands of taking it to the next step. One is a system called GPR, ground penetrating radar. Essentially what this is sending radar signals into the ground to try to look for a response, or to look for something which may hit, and then send a signal back to indicate that there's something weird or different happening on the ground. The second system is a system called magnetometry. This is perhaps the most popular one. You can see an example of this happening in the field in the image that you can see. And what this does is send signals into the ground to look at anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field. So how does that work? So when you're sending and looking for anomalies, if you imagine if I had dug something into the ground, cut through the soil, and then filled it with whatever it may be. Over time, it could be trash, it could be construction material. That's going to send a variation or anomaly when you're looking at the signal to come back. And what that does is allow you to then determine where features may be in the ground. And the third one is perhaps the most simple form, which is surface survey. Once you have an understanding of where a site may be, or even if you don't have an understanding, through surface survey, often material on the surface can be revealed. So whether it's things such as pottery, or it's even potential features which are protruding from the ground, or perhaps most obvious, something like an actual building or a structure which has survived and is still standing over the ground. And so archaeologists then can move to the next step and start to do a full-scale excavation. Now, archaeologists work in trenches. Why they work in trenches is what you want to do is maximize the amount of material you're going to capture, but minimize the amount of effort. And so if you do something like a thin strip, a trench, you can then try to capture a section of a building or a settlement or a grave or whatever it may be, and try to observe and discern as much data as possible. So the excavation, now what an excavation essentially you're doing, essentially you have to imagine it as if you're looking at a cake, a big layered, perhaps a big wedding cake. And naturally you start from the bottom and you work your way up. You build it in layers. You start from the big foundational layer and you go higher and higher and higher. Archaeology, in a way, functions in the same principles. You have the oldest layer, the first one that you started with, at the bottom, and the newest layer at the top. And so what we're doing when we're excavating is essentially going in reverse. We're starting with the newest stuff and we're going backwards in time. So although I mentioned the cake analogy earlier, which is of course a very simplistic way of understanding it, what's more representative is something like this, which is a stratigraphic matrix. Because what happens over time is different civilizations cut into previous layers to make perhaps a well or a foundations for a building which they need to create. And so you have a mix and mashup of different civilizations interacting with one another. And so it creates something like this. And what we try to do is understand every layer in context. Now, what are we looking for when we're trying to piece together all the ingredients of an excavation? So I'll just go through them very quickly. Evidence of structures is a simple one, the walls or the doors of a building. Tools and equipment, whether it's hunting equipment or everyday utensils. Environmental evidence, this is something very important because it allows us to understand how populations were reacting to their environment. So I'll just go through very quickly one example, which is perhaps the most well-known or popularized example within archaeology, which is the human remains, the skeletons and bodies, and what we can discern from this. So on the top left, you've got a dental carry. This shows that when we had this transition from from hunter-gatherer societies to the Neolithic, which is agricultural societies, this was quite a change in our diets. We started to eat more carbohydrates, and this had an impact on our teeth, and we can see this in the archaeological record. On the top right there, you have an image of a mass burial, hundreds and hundreds of bones within one burial. And perhaps there's indications that society was a lot more egalitarian at this time, in the sense that they considered themselves to be equal, and they would be sharing not only in their living environments, but also in their afterlife. And the bottom right is the opposite of that example. This is an incredible burial from the site of Varna in Bulgaria, where you can see this body is adorned with gold, but other burials are not. And so you can start to see there's indication that this person was more important in society than other people. And the bottom left needs no introduction, which is mummification. And mummification, of course, was a practice which has been not only in ancient Egypt, there's examples from Peru and other places in the world. And we can start to really get an understanding of how people were living at this time. So after the excavation, once we have all these ingredients in place and we've started to understand what a site may have looked like, we can pull together something such as this. This is a 3D model of the site of Silchester, which is actually not too far from where we are today. This was the time when Romans occupied Britain. And you can see how you can go into incredible detail and depth, looking at what some of the structures would look like, what some of the buildings were, the building materials used, zoom in and out of alleyways and ancient streets, and start to piece together how society would have functioned. So, all in all, why archaeology? What is the purpose of this field of study? Now, we've talked about this in the past, but I think it boils down to three main things. One is to understand our human past. Where have we come from? Why are we standing where we are today? And where can we then move forward from understanding the examples of the past? Secondly is to challenge misconceptions, and we talked about this in the interview earlier, in the sense that history is very skewed. We understand history to follow a very particular narrative, but archaeology cuts through a lot of that, because that narrative fails to look at civilizations such as those in Africa. And we've got this example on the screen here of the pyramids of Meroe in Sudan. Sudan actually had more pyramids than Egypt, but of course these aspects are not so well known or popularized, and archaeology has the ability to then promote some of these aspects of history and provide a sense of pride to various aspects that are underrepresented. And finally, to be able to understand where we are going today, we need to understand the lessons from our past. And those include examples we talked about earlier, from how to live sustainably, how to interact with other societies, and learning from examples from the past allows us to do that.
Rizwan, once again, thank you so much for opening up your fascinating world of archaeology to us and our viewers. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Viewers, as you saw there, research covers a vast array of topic areas and subtopics, each with a plethora of applications to address real-life issues. This brings us to the end of our program today, and I hope now, like me, you are also a little more enlightened into the wonderful world of archaeology. Do join me next time for another episode of Insight.